The penthouse apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't soothe but suffocated. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, marking each agonizing second. Rebecca Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the glittering New York skyline, but she wasn't seeing it. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in a mess of uncertainty and dread. For weeks, something had been off. Daniel had changed. It wasn't anything obvious. No lipstick on collars. No strange perfume lingering on his clothes. It was more insidious than that. The small things. The way his hand no longer lingered on the small of her back when they walked together. The way he seemed distant, his eyes locked on his phone when they used to be locked on her. The way his kisses had gone from warm and lingering to obligatory, almost absent-minded. She had tried to brush it off, telling herself that all marriages went through phases. That stress at work was to blame, that she was just overthinking. But tonight, she couldn't lie to herself anymore. Daniel's phone buzzed on the marble countertop, the vibration cutting through the stillness like a knife. Rebecca glanced at it instinctively, her fingers already reaching for it. It was a habit. After 10 years of marriage, they never hid things from each other. But the second she saw the message on the screen, her breath caught in her throat. "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about last night." The world tilted. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her fingers tightening around the phone as if it might slip away. The message was from an unknown number, but she knew, deep in her bones, what it meant. She read it again, her mind scrambling for explanations, for excuses, for anything that could make this something other than what it clearly was. But there was no way to twist it into innocence. Rebecca set the phone down, her hands trembling. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out rational thought. The logical part of her brain told her to wait, to breathe, to confront him calmly when he came home. But the other part, the part ruled by the pounding in her chest, by the sickening knot forming in her stomach, needed answers now. She picked up the phone again, swiping at the screen. Locked. A 6-digit passcode stood between her and the truth. Rebecca stared at it, her mind racing. Daniel never used to lock his phone, and even when he started, she had always known his code. She tried his birthday. Incorrect. Their anniversary. Incorrect. A sharp chill ran through her, wrapping around her spine like ice. He had changed it. Why would he change it? Her fingers clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach, heavy and nauseating. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But the rationalizations were weak, flimsy, unraveling the moment she grasped at them. Daniel had secrets, and secrets had the power to destroy everything. The weight of silence. She sat at the kitchen island, staring at the phone as if it might confess its sins. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The weight in her chest only grew heavier, suffocating. The soft creak of the front door made her sit up straight, her breath catching. Dana was home. Her heart pounded as she quickly placed the phone back on the counter, arranging it as if she had never touched it. She folded her hands in her lap, pressing her thighs together to keep them from trembling. The door swung open, and there he was, her husband. He looked normal, not like a man carrying the weight of an affair. But then again, what did a cheater look like? He was dressed in his usual navy suit, his tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it too many times. There was an exhaustion in his posture, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once held so much love for her, looked distant. Not absent, just elsewhere. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth, familiar, but somehow wrong. "You're up late." Rebecca forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. Daniel walked toward her, leaning down to press a kiss to her temple. The touch was light, fleeting, as if he were kissing an acquaintance rather than his wife. She hated how much that hurt. "You hungry?" he asked, heading toward the fridge. "I grabbed something on the way home, but I could make us something if—" "Who texted you?" The words left her lips before she could stop them. Daniel froze. It was subtle, so subtle that if she weren't watching him so closely, she might have missed it. Slowly, he turned to face her. What? Rebecca swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Your phone. It buzzed while you were out. Something flickered across his face, so quick she almost doubted she had seen it. But she knew him. She knew every little tick, every micro-expression. And right now, Daniel Sterling was calculating. Work, he said, his tone light. Too light. It's been crazy all week. A lie. She could feel it. Daniel. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Who texted you? A pause. Barely a second, but enough. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, a habit he had when he was stalling. Rebecca, it's late. Can we not do this right now? Deflection. Another red flag. Her stomach twisted, the nausea creeping higher. She could feel the moment slipping away, the chance to force the truth out of him before he built a fortress of excuses. So she said it, the words that made this real. Are you cheating on me? Daniel's head snapped up, his expression unreadable. What? The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ask you a question, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Are you cheating on me? His jaw tensed. Rebecca, no. Of course not. Then why won't you tell me who texted you? Another pause. Another breath. I think we should talk. The room felt smaller, the air pressing in around her. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Talk about what? She whispered. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her. And in his eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than an affair ever could. Guilt. And beneath that, something darker. The shattered illusion. Rebecca's chest tightened as she studied Daniel's expression. That flicker of guilt. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but she had caught it. He was hiding something. She could feel the weight of it pressing between them, thickening the air, making every breath heavier. Her voice dropped, lower now, more controlled. Then tell me. Daniel hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. He raked a hand through his dark hair, exhaling sharply. It's complicated. Complicated. Rebecca's stomach twisted at the word. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. Complicated, she echoed, the bitterness in her voice surprising even herself. Daniel, there's nothing complicated about this. Either you tell me the truth, or what? His voice was sharper now, defensive. The shift in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. She stood up from the kitchen stool, pushing it back slightly. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she forced herself to hold his gaze. Or I'll find out myself. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Jesus, Rebecca. He ran his hands over his face, exhaling. This is ridiculous. But it wasn't, because if there was nothing to hide, why was he acting like a man caught in a lie? Rebecca took a step forward. Who is she? Daniel's eyes darkened. There's no one. Then why did you change your phone passcode? He froze, a fraction of a second too long. Rebecca felt her heart crack. She had been grasping at the last threads of hope, praying for any sign that she was wrong. But there it was, his hesitation, his silence. It was all the confirmation she needed. Her throat tightened as she whispered, How long? Daniel exhaled sharply, stepping back. Rebecca, please. How long? She demanded, her voice shaking. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. And then, finally he spoke. A few months. The world blurred. Rebecca felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. Her chest constricted, her pulse roaring in her ears. Months. He had been lying to her for months. Sleeping beside her, kissing her, pretending, all while betraying her. Her nails dug in her palms, but she barely felt it. Who is she? Daniel looked away, jaw tight. And that was the moment she knew. Not just that he had cheated, but that he had loved her. The other woman. Because if it had been meaningless, if it had just been a mistake, he would have said so. He would have begged for forgiveness. But he couldn't even look at her. Rebecca's breath hitched, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to hurt him away he had just gutted her. But instead, she whispered, Get out. Daniel's head snapped up. Rebecca, get out. She could barely hear her own voice over the blood rushing in her ears. Her body trembled, every muscle screaming at her to hold herself together, to not shatter completely. Daniel hesitated. For a second, she thought he might fight for her. But then he exhaled, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. And just like that, the life she thought she knew crumbled around her. The moment Daniel walked out the door, silence crashed over the apartment like a wave. Rebecca stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the space where he had just been. The air still carried the faintest trace of his cologne, a scent she had once found comforting. Now it felt suffocating. Her body trembled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He's gone. He actually left. The weight of it hit her all at once. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The sobs came violently, shaking her body, tearing through her chest like something primal. She pressed her palms against her face, as if she could physically hold herself together, but it was useless. The pain had already split her open. Daniel had been her world, her husband, her best friend, and now, in a matter of minutes, he had become a stranger. She had thought betrayal would feel like anger, like rage burning through her veins. But it didn't. It felt like death, like something inside her had been severed, bleeding out on the floor. The ghost of a marriage. She didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes, hours. Time had lost its shape. The city outside continued as if nothing had happened. Cars honking, distant laughter, the hum of life moving forward. But inside the penthouse, time stood still. At some point, Rebecca's tears dried up, leaving her hollow. She forced herself to stand, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Her knees felt weak, but she moved on autopilot, her body carrying her to the bedroom. Their bedroom. The sheets were still neatly tucked from the morning. Daniel's watch rested on the nightstand, along with the book he had been reading. A life that no longer existed. Rebecca clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her eyes locked onto the closet. She walked toward it slowly, like approaching crime scene. She hesitated before reaching for the door. A part of her feared what she might find. Lipstick stains on collars, unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes, undeniable proof of what he had done. But when she pulled it open, everything looked the same. His suits were neatly arranged, his shoes lined up like always. Her gaze fell to the bottom shelf, where his travel bag sat. Something about it nagged at her. She crouched down, pulling it out. The zipper was partially open, and inside, a woman's scarf. Rebecca's breath hitched. Soft fabric. Silk. Expensive. It wasn't hers. A fresh wound ripped open inside her chest. He had been careless. Or maybe he hadn't cared enough to hide it properly. A sharp, bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat, but it died before it could escape. She threw the scarf onto the floor as if it burned her, then grabbed his travel bag and dumped everything out. Clothes, toiletries, a spare charger. Nothing else suspicious. But it didn't matter. She had her answer. He had been with her. In hotels. In places Rebecca didn't even want to picture. Her hand shook as she stepped back. The room blurred around her. She needed to get out, before she lost herself completely. Nowhere to run. Rebecca didn't remember leaving the apartment, but suddenly she was outside, cold air hitting her face. She walked blindly through the streets, past couples holding hands, past people laughing into their phones. It felt surreal, watching the world move on while she stood there, broken. Her feet carried her to the one place she knew she could go. Lauren's apartment. Her best friend opened the door within seconds, dressed in leggings and an oversized hoodie. Her blonde hair was messy, like she had been asleep. But the second she saw Rebecca's face, she sobered instantly. Oh my God. Rebecca tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Lauren didn't ask any questions. She just pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. And for the first time since that message had appeared on Daniel's phone, Rebecca felt like she wasn't drowning alone. Lauren didn't let go of Rebecca for a long time. Her arms were strong, grounding, but even as Rebecca clung to her, shaking, she felt like she was falling. Finally, Lauren pulled back, her green eyes searching Rebecca's face. Tell me what happened. Rebecca's lips parted, but her throat closed up. She had screamed, sobbed, collapsed on the floor of her apartment. She had gone through every shade of agony in the past few hours. But now, standing here in Lauren's warm, dimly lit apartment, she felt cold. She took a shaky breath. Daniel cheated on me. The words tasted foreign, like someone else's tragedy. Lauren's eyes widened. What? Rebecca let out a hollow laugh, running a hand through her tangled hair. Months. He's been doing this for months. She expected Lauren to explode, to curse, to scream about what a bastard Daniel was. But instead, her friend's face twisted with something softer, sadder. Oh, Beck. And that broke something inside her all over again. Because it wasn't just anger. It was pity, and pity made it real. Rebecca turned away, crossing the living room with quick, aimless steps. Her skin itched like she needed to rip it off, like she could peel away the betrayal if she tried hard enough. I don't know what to do. Her voice cracked. Lauren walked up behind her, hesitant. Have you talked to him? Rebecca let out a bitter laugh. He left. Lauren's jaw tightened. Did he at least try to? No, Rebecca spun around, her chest rising and falling. I told him to leave, and he did. Her hands clenched into fists. No fight, no begging, no trying to fix it. He just walked out. Lauren flinched. She shook her head at a loss. Rebecca's breath came faster. The more she said it out loud, the worse it got. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, crushing her. He didn't fight for me. Her stomach twisted violently. Lauren reached for her. Beck. But Rebecca stepped back. I can't be here. She didn't even know what she needed. She just needed out. The deep end. The streets blurred as she walked. Maybe she had grabbed a coat before she left Lauren's place. Maybe she hadn't. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The city pulsed around her. Lights flickering, voices echoing, life moving forward. And she was stuck. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. She pulled it out with shaking hands. Daniel. A missed call. Then another. Then a text. Rebecca, please. Let's talk. Her vision tunneled. Talk. Now he wanted to talk. She stared at the screen, her pulse roaring in her ears. A part of her wanted to call him. To scream, to cry, to ask him why. Why wasn't I enough? Why wasn't our life enough? But another part, the part that had been shattered beyond repair, wanted to hurt him. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Then, without thinking, she typed back. Where's she? The typing bubble appeared. Vanished. Appeared again. She held her breath. Rebecca, please. This won't help. The world slowed. Every nerve in her body went rigid. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't saying there is no she. He was protecting her. The woman who had burned their marriage to the ground. Rage flooded Rebecca's veins so fast it made her dizzy. She typed 2 words. Tell me. Silence. The typing bubble flickered, then stopped. Then finally, a response. The Beaumont Hotel. Room 1407. Rebecca stared at the screen, her breath shallow. Then, before she could stop herself, she hailed the next taxi. The other woman. The Beaumont Hotel loomed above her, glittering with wealth and power. Rebecca barely registered it. She stormed through the glass doors, past the pristine marble floors, past the concierge's polite nod. The elevator ride was suffocating. Each floor she passed made her pulse pound harder. 14. The doors slid open. Rebecca stepped out, her hands shaking. The hallway stretched before her, long and endless. The numbers blurred in her vision until 1407. She stopped. Her breath came in quick bursts. Her heart felt like it would rip through her ribs. This is it. A part of her knew she shouldn't be here. That this was reckless, desperate, pathetic. But another part, the part that was already broken, wanted the truth. She raised her hand and knocked. A long silence. Then footsteps. Then the door opened. Rebecca's lungs collapsed. The woman in front of her was young. Younger than she had expected. Maybe mid-20s. Perfectly styled hair. A silky robe tied loosely at the waist, revealing smooth, golden skin. She was beautiful. And when her dark eyes met Rebecca's, there was something else. Not surprise. Not even guilt. Recognition. She knew who Rebecca was. Rebecca's stomach twisted violently. The woman exhaled, tilting her head. And then, she smiled. Rebecca snapped. Her hand flew out before she even knew what she was doing. The sound of skin against skin cracked through the hallway. The woman's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning red. Then, slowly, she turned back. And she laughed. Low, amused, almost pitying. You must be Rebecca. The final thread inside Rebecca snapped. Before she knew it, she was shoving the woman back, storming into the room, searching for proof, any sign of Daniel. And then she saw it. His jacket, draped over the chair. The room smelled like him. Rebecca swayed, gripping the edge of the desk. It was real, all of it, and she had walked straight into the lion's den. The woman leaned against the wall, watching her with something almost like curiosity. Did you really think he was going to stop? Rebecca's nails dug into the wood. Where is he? The woman just smiled. You don't want to know. Rebecca stood in the hotel room, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, as though it was the only thing holding her upright. The woman, the one who had ruined everything, stood across from her with that smug, self-satisfied smile. But it wasn't just her face that made Rebecca feel small. It was the entire situation. It was the fact that she was here, in this moment, at the very heart of the destruction of her life. Her eyes locked on the woman's face, but it wasn't really her that Rebecca was looking at. It was Daniel. Where was he? Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the room, as though hoping to find some sign of him, some shred of the man she had loved. But everything felt hollow. There was no love in this space, only lies, betrayal, and a chill she could feel down to her bones. The woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. I told you, you don't want to know. Rebecca's hand tightened into a fist, nails digging into her palm. You think this is a game? You think you can just smile and pretend like you're innocent in all this? The woman's eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. There was no fear in her gaze, only that cold, calculating amusement. You've seen it now, haven't you? He's not coming for you. Not anymore. You're nothing to him. Rebecca's breath hitched as the words cut deeper than anything else had. But there was something else, something more venomous in the air. It wasn't just the fact that Daniel had betrayed her. It was the fact that this woman, this stranger, was standing here so calmly like she had somehow won. Rebecca opened her mouth to scream, to yell, to unleash all the pain she'd been carrying since the first text, but nothing came out. There were no words left, just the suffocating weight of the betrayal crushing her lungs. She dropped her head in her hands, shaking with the effort to keep herself from breaking completely. The woman didn't move. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice low and almost sympathetic now. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Rebecca's head shot up, eyes wide in disbelief. You didn't mean for it to happen? Her voice was raw, ragged. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew exactly who I was. You knew I existed. And you still. I never wanted to hurt you, the woman interrupted, her tone shifting from cold to almost soft. She hesitated, looking away for a moment before meeting Rebecca's gaze again. I'm not proud of this, but he was so broken. You didn't see it. You didn't see how he needed someone to see him, to care about him. I wasn't trying to replace you. I wasn't. Rebecca's heart slammed in her chest, hearing this woman, hearing her justify what she'd done. She was rationalizing. I don't want to hear it, Rebecca spat, stepping forward. You don't get to justify this. You don't get to make excuses for him. And you sure as hell don't get to make excuses for what you've done. The woman flinched, but there was no apology in her eyes, just cold indifference. I didn't come here to make excuses, but you need to know that he was never really yours. Not like you think. Rebecca's head swam with the revelation. He was never really mine? That was it. That was the final blow. Her body trembled from the effort of holding back tears, but she refused to let them fall. I need to talk to him, Rebecca whispered, almost more to herself than to the woman. I need to hear it from him. I need him to tell me. The woman smirked, her lips curling upward in a way that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Why bother? You already know. You just don't want to admit it to yourself. Rebecca shook her head violently, the words not sinking in. She had to hear it from Daniel himself. She had to see the pain in his eyes. She had to know that he understood what he had done. And then, finally, she would make him pay. The confrontation. Rebecca's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She didn't know how long she'd been standing there, or how long the woman had been watching her. The world felt muffled, like she was underwater. All she knew was that she needed answers. She needed them now. She dialed Daniel's number. The ringing tone felt like an eternity, each second an excruciating reminder of the silence between them. Then, finally, Rebecca. His voice cracked like glass breaking. Rebecca's heart shattered into a million pieces at the sound of his name. God, why did it still hurt to hear his voice? "Where are you?" she managed to ask, her voice tight with the fury she couldn't fully express. I'm at home." His voice faltered. "Beck, I didn't want you to find out like this. Please just—" "Don't you dare," Rebecca cut him off, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "You knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing when you left me for her. Don't you dare try to tell me this wasn't your fault. I never meant to hurt you, Beck." His voice was softer now, filled with what sounded like regret, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "You already did," Rebecca said, each word laced with a bitterness that surprised even her. "You've already hurt me. You've already killed everything between us." There was a long silence. Rebecca pressed her lips together, forcing back the sobs that threatened to escape. She couldn't let him see her like this. Not after everything. "I need you to say it," she demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I need you to say it. I need to hear you say that you did this. That you destroyed everything." "I didn't want this, Rebecca," Daniel said, his voice cracking again. "But I did. I ruined it. I'm sorry. Sorry. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough." A cold silence. Rebecca ended the call without another word. She turned to the woman in the room, who was still standing by the door, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Are you happy now?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You got what you wanted?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at Rebecca for a long moment, almost like she was sizing her up. Finally, she spoke. "No, I'm not happy, but I'm not sorry either." Rebecca's heart twisted in her chest. The woman wasn't sorry for anything. She had won. She had taken Daniel away from Rebecca, and there was nothing Rebecca could do to change that. The woman turned to leave, but Rebecca stopped her with one last question. "Do you love him?" The woman paused, and for the briefest second, Rebecca saw something shift in her eyes. It was fleeting, but Rebecca caught it. A flash of uncertainty. "I don't know," she said softly, before walking out of the room. The weight of silence was unbearable. The word from the last conversation with Daniel echoed in Rebecca's mind like a constant hum. She could hear him apologizing, repeating the same lines over and over, as if they could somehow mend the wound he'd caused. Sorry. It meant nothing now. It was just a word, a bandage on a wound that would never heal. Rebecca's hands trembled as she stared at the phone, the screen dark from the call that had ended. She had hung up without a second thought, the sound of his voice still lingering in the air. The longer she stayed in this empty hotel room, the more suffocating the space became. She needed to get out, get away from everything. But where could she go? The answer was nowhere. Everything reminded her of him. She had tried to take the day off, to let herself breathe for a moment, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Everywhere she looked, memories of their time together surfaced. The smell of the perfume he'd once bought her, the text messages that used to make her smile, each small thing now felt like a cruel reminder of a life she once knew, one that had slipped away in the blink of an eye. Rebecca couldn't tell anyone the truth. Not her friends, not her family, because how could she explain it? How could she tell them that the man she had trusted, the one she had loved, had betrayed her in the most brutal way possible? How could she explain that she was still in love with him, even after everything? The world outside the hotel seemed to move on without her, indifferent to her pain. Rebecca had been staring out of the window for what felt like hours, watching the street below, when she finally heard a knock on the door. Her heart stopped. It was him. For a moment, her legs froze. Could she face him again? Could she allow herself to open the door and hear him say anything else? Her hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but she stopped herself before she could open it. It was too soon. She wasn't ready. She needed more time. But the knocking didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rebecca dragged herself to the door. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal of the handle, but instead of opening the door immediately, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had to hear him out. She had to know what he was going to say. With one last, shaky exhale, she opened the door. Standing in front of her was Daniel, his face ashen, eyes red from what Rebecca assumed was a restless night of his own. His lips parted, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "I'm sorry, Beck," he said softly, voice trembling. "I know you don't want to see me right now, but please, just let me talk. Let me explain." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Explain? What could he possibly say to make this any better? "You had your chance to explain," she replied, her voice hard but quiet. "You had every opportunity to tell me the truth, to be honest with me, and instead, you lied. You lied to me for months, Daniel." His eyes flickered with guilt, but there was something else, something darker lurking behind his expression. He took a step closer, his voice growing more urgent. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. I never—" "Stop!" She cut him off, holding up a hand to stop him. "Don't you dare say that again. Don't you dare tell me you didn't want to hurt me. Because you did. You knew exactly what you were doing." Daniel stood there for a long moment, looking defeated. The man she had once thought was her rock now appeared as broken as she felt, but it didn't matter. His shattered image no longer meant anything to her. Her heart ached, but the words she needed to say felt like poison on her tongue. "You made your choice, Daniel," Rebecca continued, each word dragging her deeper into the pit of anger and despair. "And now I have to make mine. I won't be a part of this lie anymore." "Rebecca," he whispered her name, almost like a prayer, but Rebecca turned away from him. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to see him. She didn't want him anymore. There was a long silence before Daniel finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never stopped loving you. I know I don't deserve it, but I do." Rebecca froze. His words lingered in the air, and for a moment, everything inside her seemed to come to a standstill. She could feel the cracks in her resolve, the aching need to believe him, to take him back and somehow patch up the pieces of her broken heart. But then the reality of what he had done hit her again. His betrayal wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a fundamental break in everything they had built together. And no matter how much it hurt, Rebecca knew she could never go back to that place. "No," she said, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "You can't love me and hurt me at the same time. You don't get to pick and choose when you want to care. It doesn't work like that." Daniel's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, heavy breath. "I don't know what I was thinking. I was stupid. I was selfish. But please, please don't walk away from me." Rebecca looked at him one last time. The man who had been her everything, the man who had betrayed her trust. And for a moment, she saw the cracks in him too, the pain, the regret, but none of it mattered anymore. She shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not the one walking away from this, Daniel," she whispered. "You already did that." Without another word, she closed the door, leaving him standing there in the hallway, the silence between them growing even deeper than before. The empty house. Back in the apartment, the silence was deafening. Rebecca had returned home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The space was so quiet, so foreign, like it no longer held any of the warmth it once had. She hadn't been here since the argument, and now, as she walked through the empty rooms, everything felt so cold. Her fingers brushed the frame of a picture that used to make her smile. It was a photo from their anniversary, a candid shot of the two of them laughing. It felt like a lifetime ago. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Rebecca woke up in the early hours of the morning, the faintest light creeping through the blinds. It was still dark outside, but the weight of the silence in her apartment was unbearable. The last few days had felt like one long, unbroken stretch of exhaustion. No matter how much sleep she got, she could never quite escape the emotional chaos that had settled deep within her. Her eyes wandered to the phone beside her on the bed, where she had left it after her conversation with Daniel. No new messages, no missed calls, just the haunting silence that had become her constant companion. The thought of him still lingered in the back of her mind, no matter how many times she told herself to let go. She hadn't allowed herself to fully process the pain of everything he had done, and now, Every corner of her mind was filled with questions, regret, and confusion. She couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Could she ever truly erase the connection they had once shared? A loud bang from the street below interrupted her thoughts. She rolled over, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She needed to go outside to get some fresh air. Maybe it would clear her head, even if just for a few minutes. Pulling herself out of bed, Rebecca dressed quickly and stepped out into the cool morning air. The city around her seemed to be waking up at a slow pace. Cars honking, people rushing by, a steady hum of life that she used to find comforting. Now it only felt like noise. As she walked aimlessly, the streets became a blur, and her thoughts churned. She had been trying to block out everything that had happened with Daniel, but it seemed impossible. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. Her chest felt tight, her stomach constantly in knots. Rebecca's mind kept replaying the image of Daniel standing at her door, his face desperate and broken. His words, his apologies, they should have been enough. But they weren't. She had given him her heart. She had trusted him completely, and in return, he had shattered everything they had built. There was no going back from that. The city was filled with life, but Rebecca felt like she was moving through it in a daze. Everything felt numb. The flashback, a love once pure. It wasn't always like this. Rebecca closed her eyes as she leaned against a nearby railing, taking in a deep breath. She thought back to when things were different, when she and Daniel had first met. It felt like a lifetime ago, but in her mind, it was as vivid as if it had happened just yesterday. She remembered the way Daniel had looked when they met for the first time, a little unsure of himself, but with a warmth in his smile that made her feel safe. She had been struck by his openness, his ability to make her feel like she was the only person in the room. They had clicked instantly, and it didn't take long before their relationship deepened. He was everything she had ever wanted. When they first started dating, everything had felt perfect. He was kind, affectionate, always ready to support her when she needed it. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and the way they looked at each other made it clear to anyone around them how deeply in love they were. She had never doubted him, until now. As the memories of their happier times flooded her, it felt almost painful to think about how quickly things had unraveled. Daniel had once made her feel seen, heard, loved in a way she had never experienced before. And now, the same man who had once promised her the world had betrayed her in a way that felt unforgivable. But as much as it hurt, Rebecca knew there was no turning back. She had loved him fully, trusted him completely, and he had thrown that all away for something that could never replace what they had shared. The decision. The pain was still there, gnawing at her insides, but something had shifted within her over the past few days. She had to move on. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rebecca realized something she had been avoiding. Her worth didn't depend on Daniel. She had spent so long thinking that he was the one who completed her, that without him, she would never be whole. But that wasn't true. She wasn't broken. She wasn't incomplete. Rebecca was a person on her own, and she deserved better than someone who would betray her trust so casually. She had to remind herself that she wasn't defined by what Daniel did to her. She wasn't just a victim of his mistakes. She was stronger than that. And so, as she walked the streets, the weight on her chest lightened ever so slightly. It wasn't gone, not yet, but it was a start. Rebecca stopped at a small cafe, the one they had always passed by on their walks through the city. She sat down at a table by the window, looking out at the bustling street. It was a small moment of peace, a rare one in the days since everything had fallen apart. As she sipped her coffee, she pulled out her phone and opened her messages. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. It was time to move forward. Her thumb hovered over Daniel's name. She had to make a decision, but it wasn't one she had to make for him. It was for herself. Rebecca took a deep breath and deleted his number. The turning point. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was also the most freeing. As soon as she hit the delete button, the heaviness she had been carrying seemed to lift. Rebecca wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet, and maybe not ever. But she was finally ready to let go. She was ready to put the pieces of herself back together. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a message from her best friend, Emma. You okay? We need to talk soon. Love you. Rebecca smiled softly at the message. She knew Emma was always there for her, always ready to help her when things got rough. Maybe it was time to let others in again. Maybe it was time to focus on the relationships that truly mattered, the ones built on trust, loyalty, and love, not betrayal. Rebecca took another sip of her coffee, feeling a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find herself again. And this time, she would never let anyone take that away. End of chapter 6. In this final chapter, Rebecca reaches a moment of clarity. She chooses herself. The chapter brings closure to her relationship with Daniel, and while the emotional scars remain, she begins the painful process of healing and reclaiming her life. The decision to delete his number symbolizes her decision to move on and focus on the future, allowing herself the space to rebuild and rediscover her strength. The pain of betrayal will always linger, but for the first time in a long while, she's ready to face the world on her own terms. Would you like to continue exploring Rebecca's healing journey, or move in another direction for the next phase of her story? Chapter 7. The Beginning of Tomorrow. The world had shifted in a way Rebecca couldn't fully understand. She felt like a different person now, but the truth was she wasn't sure who that person was just yet. The changes were subtle, like waking up from a long, restless sleep, still groggy and unsure if the world around her was real. Her apartment felt different now. It was quieter without Daniel's laughter echoing through the rooms, but it was also lighter, as though the air itself was free of the weight it had once carried. She hadn't heard from him since the day she deleted his number. At first, she had wondered if that was a mistake, but now, it felt like the only thing she could do to protect herself. Rebecca was sitting in a coffee shop on a Sunday afternoon, the familiar hum of conversations filling the air. She had been coming here more often lately. The people around her, lost in their own little worlds, gave her a sense of normalcy, a sense that she, too, could return to something resembling a life without the constant pain of betrayal. The barista slid her cappuccino across the counter with a smile, and she nodded, thanking him softly. She had started to realize that small acts of kindness, even from strangers, could make a big difference when your heart was heavy. As she sat down, her phone buzzed. A message from Emma. We need to talk soon. I've been thinking a lot about you. Let's meet up. Rebecca's heart fluttered. Emma had been her rock throughout this entire ordeal, never once judging her, never once pushing her when she wasn't ready. Emma had been the friend Rebecca could lean on when she felt the weight of everything bearing down on her. A flood of gratitude rushed through her as she typed a quick reply. I'd love that. When? A few minutes later, Emma responded with a time and a place. Rebecca smiled, feeling a rare sense of excitement. It had been a while since she'd had a chance to just be with her best friend without the shadows of her failed relationship clouding the moment. That evening, as she sat across from Emma at a small, cozy table in their favorite restaurant, Rebecca felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. They talked not just about the pain of the past few months, but also about the future, about what they wanted to do, what their dreams were. Emma had always been the one to encourage Rebecca to keep going, to remind her that there was more to life than the hurt she had experienced. I'm so proud of you, Emma said, her voice warm and genuine. You're stronger than you think, Rebecca. You've been through so much, and yet you're here, still standing. Rebecca smiled, though the words still had a hard time sinking in. She had never seen herself as particularly strong, but now, in this moment, with Emma's support, she began to believe it. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could heal. The weeks that followed were a blur of change. Rebecca immersed herself in work, threw herself into hobbies she had neglected, and spent time with friends who had supported her through the darkest days. The ache from the betrayal still existed, but it was no longer the only thing that defined her. Slowly, she began to rediscover pieces of herself that had been lost. She even started dating again, tentatively at first, unsure if she was truly ready. She went on a few dates, but none of them felt right. The men she met were kind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart wasn't yet open enough to let anyone in. It was a slow process, but every day brought her a little closer to who she used to be, and in some ways, to someone even better. It was on a crisp autumn morning, nearly 4 months after everything had ended with Daniel, when Rebecca found herself walking down the street, a bag of groceries in her hand, and a sense of peace settling over her. The city seemed alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt like she belonged here. Her phone rang, the ringtone cutting through the quiet hum of the city. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, but then answered. "Hello, Rebecca?" Her heart dropped. It was Daniel. For a brief moment, her mind flooded with emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion. But then, something within her shifted. She had been waiting for this moment, hadn't she? The moment where he would try to come back into her life. But the truth was, she wasn't the same person anymore. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I can't talk right now." She didn't wait for him to respond before she ended the call, her finger hovering over the screen as she stared at his name for a moment longer. And then, without a second thought, she blocked his number. For the first time, there was no guilt, no second-guessing. There was only relief. Rebecca didn't know exactly what the future held, but she was finally ready to live it. She didn't need Daniel. She didn't need anyone to define her. She had learned that she was enough on her own, that she could find happiness and peace within herself. And as she walked down the street, the autumn breeze lifting her hair, she realized that her journey had just begun.